Thank you so much, Stephanie. We're really delighted to be here with you today, and I'm also so thrilled to have 4 exceptional conversationalists here on stage. But as we were catching up ahead of this conversation, because something Shumon told me that conversations are doomed on stage unless they began off stage, was the architecture of conversations. How do you kind of set up the space for good conversation to happen? So to start, we really want to get closer together and have more of a kind of huddle. And also that includes you. So we need you all, like really all of you. That means you, Ann Barlow, and you, Stephanie, and you, Jack, and everyone else I see. Please come to the front.
Forward.
Yeah, please come forward.
Yeah.
Please come forward.
Because it can't be this.
And also,
I don't know what that'll do to the recording, but
okay.
You guys can manage, right?
We also, if someone from the Art Basel team can help us, we would love to add like a seat or two on stage, because we, perhaps if someone wants to ask a question, we can like make this, we can join other people into the conversation as well. And with this, we also want to say hi to everyone watching us online, because we were thinking about audiences and we know what a huge reach this has, also outside of the people in this room. And we really encourage, a conversation is not a monologue like what I'm saying right now. It's a back and forth. So to kind of kickstart this conversation, something that we were talking about is something that draws these 4 professionals together is that rather than simply focusing on an exhibition or the presentation of artworks, they also focus and experiment with models of creating conversations or platforms for ideas beyond the object. And there are more and more, almost every art fair today has a talks program, but a lot of these people actually began talks programs of different ways before this kind of wave. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of talk about our context and why some of these programs started. And maybe we can start with Mary, who has the youngest summit in the room, just launched last week, I think. And Mary has also worked for Art Basel convening conversations as well. So maybe if you can talk about this new context and how you've pulled the other contexts in.
Well, to be really honest, the conversation started when I was in high school talking on the phone all the time. And this is like the old days when there was a cord that connected the phone to the wall and the curly thing into the bathroom and getting yelled at. And then now when I tell my family members that I'm actually getting paid to do this, it's quite a shock. But on all seriousness, the Beijing Art Summit, which was just launched last week, is initiated by 7 Star Corporation, and then they are the ones that started the 798 Art District in Beijing, which some of you may already be familiar with. It's been around for a long time. And they invited us. So Colin Chinnery, my co-curator, who is my Chinese counterpart, he invited the people from China and the region, and I invited people from abroad. So it was about bringing people together for introductions, and we can talk more about that later. But my real beginnings of this was when I was working at 303 Gallery and going to the fairs and sneaking off the booth to go to the conversations, because there was people that I wanted to meet that I'd know by name, and I wanted to hear them speak and get to know what their interests were and who they were. And so then after that, then when I wasn't working at the gallery anymore, then Mark Spiegler said, hey, do you want to get involved? And so one thing led to another. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. And maybe, since you talked about some of these things or in your professional life after high school and the phone, being around, working at a gallery, maybe Prateek, you can also talk about the Curators Hub and as a gallery, how you've taken the kind of art of the Ada in Bengal and brought it into your program.
Right. So I'm from Calcutta, and in our part of the world, conversations are a way of life. We get around each other and just talk. And I felt that this is almost 9 years ago when we started the Curators Hub, there was a space that was kind of missing in regular interaction, and that space for conversation was slowly diminishing, especially in South Asia, and we spoke about this briefly in our pre-talk, and felt that it was necessary to have a way to go beyond the exhibitions program and bring people together to converse. And we started with the Curators Hub 9 years ago. This is going to be our 10th. And it was essentially to bring curators together to speak about their work. And it began as a simple idea and grew to something much more than what it started out with. And it just makes the running of the gallery one part of the larger objective of what Experimenta is, and that's, I think, the power of conversations. Yeah.
And Leeza runs the Asia Contemporary Art Week in New York, and you also create a consortium of partners, which include galleries, which creates the possibility to make conversations and lecture performances and kind of bring people together that might not otherwise be able to meet. I would love to hear a bit more about you, about why you started this, and yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I need to thank Stephanie for making this panel come together. Thank you so much.
And that also was a beautiful curatorial act, and you should be on the stage too with us.
I know, yeah. You enable the conversations, right?
We'll call you up after. We'll call you up after.
Yes.
Where's that chair?
I think there's so many layers of why I felt like something like field meeting needed to happen. For many years, Asia Contemporary Art Week, occurred as a kind of a place where a group of variety of different mission-driven institutions, commercial galleries, and small nonprofit initiatives could sort of come together and really kind of make a big bang in the middle of a very overloaded programmatic space like New York. And of course, I wanted to find a way as an independent curator running this program to create space for the gaps or the invisible arenas, and there was always a way of inserting something in the middle of all of that activity. And at some point, I realized that it's so much more practical. As a woman, we always think about practicality and nurturing, and to really think about what public programs and how to harness the space of the public program where conversation can really connect you to the direct energy of an artist and their process, and the struggle of what it took to take something from the beginning of its birth to the end. But not just the artists, but also the curators, the gallery owners, the museum directors. Sometimes we think in all these categorical ways and sort of hierarchical manner, but the ecology of this system is actually beautiful, and I wanted to find a way to give voice to all of these different parts, and in a creative way that could also go beyond the object, and maybe beyond all the expenses of having to put on a very elaborate show and shipping fees and all of that hoopla that at the end ends up not necessarily always being digested by an audience. So the audience is always what I've thought about seriously, and how to be responsible for if I'm going to organize or curate a conversation or a program, how is it received? Who is going to receive it? What are they going to do with it? How is it going to be spread far and beyond? And thus the birth of Field Meeting as a sort of a place to experiment, think, and cultivate the field.
And Shumon, if you can give us a bit of an introduction into the Global Art Forum, which has, of course, the word global in it, but is extremely rooted in Dubai and like a kind of keystone of the art fair. I know some people come specifically to attend the Global Art Forum. I'd love to hear some more about that.
Sure. Well, unlike, I think, your programs and yours, Diana, and even the Beijing Art Summit, I didn't invent the Global Art Forum. It predates me, so I kind of it's something I inherited. But in a sense, actually, it started in a familiar format. I think familiar to where we are now. I think in 2007, when Art Dubai started, obviously in Dubai, then one of its kind of programming components was a talks program, which was called the Global Art Forum, and was programmed by someone called Maria Finders, and I think it served a purpose at that point. So we're talking the sort of mid to late 2000s, before the financial crisis, where Dubai had become suddenly this a kind of it's extreme visibility and the global imagination. But in terms of, let's say, art and art discourse, there was a lag. And at those first few years, I think, were, there was important groundwork done, which is where you bring a lot of institutions and institutional characters were brought over. But then I took over a few years later, I guess, edition about number 4 or 5. And then at that point, I decided that also, I think this question of trying to detect what's missing in a particular context. And so what I thought was missing in that part of the world was a kind of a certain culture of public discourse that still hadn't taken off yet. And I got inspired by a number of things. One, I come from a magazine background, editor in large at Tank magazine. I've been working with Badoon magazine for a long time. I've also kind of grown up with magazines, also television, also radio. I kind of my brain has been formatted by all these media formats, and I wanted to sort of bring that and then somehow give shape to where we were in the world. So the interesting thing about somewhere like Dubai is that it can arguably belong to a number of different geographies. So it could easily belong to North Africa, or it can belong to the kind of Central Asia, it could belong to West Asia, et cetera, et cetera. And somehow going through there, if you tell the story of Dubai, you have to tell the story of, by necessity, through a concatenation of places. And so I wanted to use that also in terms of disciplines. So it's just purely how my brain works, is that I'm interested when disciplines try and get out of the kind of bubbles of only talking within themselves and have conversations or even arguments across each other or with each other. And weirdly enough, that still doesn't happen enough, right? Like, I think we're still kind of in these professional silos, even though the way in which we consume the world is not like that, right? Like, if you think about all the different things that you kind of go through, even just in the morning through your feed, but then there's a way in which your professional being is often only with your kin, And so the Global Art Forum now has sort of developed into a transdisciplinary summit. It's themed each year, and then and the theme often resonates with where we are in the world, but also where we are in the world historically, culturally, politically. So last year was automation. We just did education. We've done trade. We've done historiography. We've done media, and each time the whole point is to bring a cast list of on one stage will be a filmmaker, will be a philosopher, will be a technologist, will be a political thinker, and try and kind of see what happens. Because as much as I think it's important for an audience to be nourished, the people on the stage also have to be nourished. And actually, if that's happening on stage, then hopefully it's already happening out there. So.
Absolutely. And I think something that you just said, which ties back to some of the things in our pre-conversation, was this different variety of formats. And one of the things we're asked to think about is the art of conversation. But we all know artists who are not very good conversationalists, but maybe they're really good writers. Maybe there's other ways of expressing themselves. So maybe we could talk about when do you think it's the right time to bring people on stage? How do you make those conditions? What do you think about in that process?
Should I start? Well, I mean, we were discussing this. I do think, I've just talked about the positive aspects of, the kind of valorizing of conversation, public conversation. But I do think there is a negative side to it, right? So there, we live in a time and a kind of culture where self-presentation, self-curating, has this extremely high purchase. And there's almost a point where, if you're not able to be good on stage, you don't have sufficient. It's like that then has a kind of negative deficit on everything else that you do. But I think that's deeply problematic because, again, I mean, there are amazing songwriters, but they're idiots in interviews. And that's fine, So, there's something that David Lynch always said, which was he finishes a film and then someone, Mr. Lynch, what was the film about? And he's like, I'm not going to tell you what it's about. The film is what it's about. You know, if I could tell you what it's about, I didn't have to make the film. And I think, that, you know, and I do see that with more and more with like artists. Like artists, somehow there's this kind of requirement to be able to explain or to demystify or even more mystify what they do. But I think more artists should say, no, I'm not going to do that. Like my work does that. But then maybe there'd be a kind of collateral effect on them, market-wise or cultural capital-wise, I don't know. But I do think that there's obviously a kind of fetishization and a certain particular kind of capital that's laid on the ability to be articulate and on stage. But at the same time, I think, you know, if your medium is something else, then that's your medium, right?
And I think that's something, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to expand on that a little bit to say that another criteria for like who we invite and how we invite them is to have people from different perspectives. Like we don't really want to get people to get up on stage and just agree with each other because that's so boring.
That is true.
And we want
I
them to have,
disagree with you.
I agree with you, but disagree with you.
and then I'm going to push back on that and say that we have to have different perspectives. So lots of times when I'm putting groups together of who's going to talk, they have to not agree. So I disagree with you.
And I think, Leeza, like, it was interesting when we were trying to figure out, do we have images? Do we not have images? And I was like, yeah, you know, pictures of people talking together, that's really boring. But then Leeza also mentioned, well, I have lecture performances. So I think it's also interesting in the way that as curators, we're pushed to play with exhibition formats, but you also play in a very interesting way with conversation formats. If you could speak a bit about that.
Well, I would like to address what Shumon was talking about because I think you're absolutely right. There's so much requirement from artists these days. They have to be able to write a great resume. They have to be able to write wonderful statements, blurbs, and you know, do all kinds of dances and flips for us. But a good number of them are not great at any of those things. And what I'm trying to do with you know, because I've always noted the platform as a curatorial, but also an educational format or educational platform. It means not just the education of the public or the audience, but the education of myself in the process and the education of everyone who's involved in the program. And so it's more about just being elastic and flexible and you know, being able to allow your intuition to touch a particular point where maybe someone is not doesn't have access to a particular part of themselves that is actually more developed than they think. A great deal of time in the process of curating field meeting, I discover that not only artists but curators, thinkers, writers, you know, a great many creative people get very cerebral and stuck in a particular aspect of their work that they're enamored with, and they don't actually realize that there's maybe many aspects of their work that could be read in a very much more broader manner that doesn't categorize them, that opens up a profound aspect of who they are. And so what I try to do is give voice to that by having the sort of the courage to allow myself to be vulnerable and say, I think this is better. I think you can do this. And sometimes I'm afraid of their reaction because I'm talking to some people who think they're so great. They have a very formed opinion of what they're doing. But something really magical happens with that each time, and I'm sure each of us have discovered that in the studio visit. And this process is very hermetic, and it never is really out there in an exhibition. And I wanted to open this process of like exchange that happens, that where like something is pointed out, and then there's this back and forth, and a negotiation that happens, and then something natural shows up, and we have to sort of trust that process that you know, something will happen that will be different than the usual, you know, thing that happens in a conversation, and that there will be room for receiving that by who's also in the audience, which I intentionally make sure they are committed. So the same amount of direction and the same amount of sort of like guidance that goes to the artists, and how we collaborate way advanced, like 6 months to a year ahead in preparing for field meeting in the same way an exhibition comes together. I also, really send a lot of communication out to the audience who's invited and give them guidelines of how are they going to sort of receive this content, because I've seen so many times where artists end up, or there's this wonderful, exchange going on, or presentations happening, and the audience is sort of just like not able to digest this or respond to it. So I'm trying to address all sorts of issues of like exchange in the forum.
Yeah, and two things to. I think a conversation becomes really successful, or could be successful, is when it doesn't go according to pre-planned ideas. And sometimes we've seen that, and we were discussing this before in our Curators Hub, that curators come, some of them are highly pressurized to have a public viewing, a public image of themselves, and not to forget the extra pressure of social media, Instagram posts, and your opinions, and that is an additional, anyway. Sometimes we've seen when also going back to your first question, how do you start these conversations, like create a field for a conversation, is when you're able to create an intimate setting which allows the person to open up and go beyond his levels of comfort and say something from the heart. That's when real doors open and real conversations happen. And yeah, that's...
Guys, I hate to do this to you, put you on the spot like this, but I think that you both eloquently described something like, what curators can do to bring forth a meaningful conversation. But to kind of draw people in the audience in more, could you maybe give a specific example? And I would love to put that out to both Mary and Shumon as well.
Yeah, I could give a very specific example. We had a curator who's at a Curators Hub, and who had worked with a particular artist for a long time, Nasreen Mohammadi, and was in fact at her studio a large part of her growing up years, and became very closely accustomed or used to her relationship with Nasreen. And Nasreen was going through a deteriorating health situation, and she would keep a public persona and only open out to this curator, who Rubina Karode, who of course everyone knows. And I think Rubina came prepared to speak about Nasreen's work, and then ended up speaking about a much more delicate relationship and opening up of a conversation that allowed the audience and her to reflect back on a relationship that was much beyond the work and the exhibitions that she curated. And so these kinds of possibilities, the forums that we hopefully are able to create, allow these kinds of porosities to happen, which then further a more nuanced understanding of relationships, and that relationships and trusts are what conversations are about.
I can share an example. Actually, I invited someone who's been in Kabul for over the past 8 years, and she wanted to talk about her being a white woman working in this space of conflict, trying to support artists in such a space, and the challenges of that, and the perceptions that she had to deal with, coming from a privileged place. Francesca Recchia is her name, and she now runs the Turquoise Mountain Foundation. And it was interesting. She was kind of like a fish, like one of those slippery fish that kept sort of like not meeting with me. Like we kept missing Skypes, and like her proposal was like, I don't know. I also got really busy, and she was the only one that I didn't have time to really like connect with and have like this one-on-one 2-hour Skype studio visit with. and something kept nugging me about that. I was like, I have to connect with her. Like, I need to know something about her. What she was gonna do didn't feel complete to me, and so. The night, like a week before I was going to Dubai, the last field meeting took place in Dubai in January at El Sakal Avenue, I received an email, and this is she sends every few months she sends this heartfelt email to a group of individuals that she's close to about her experiences in Afghanistan, and these letters are extremely heartfelt. Full of poetry and a kind of self-expression that's just, so touching. And I open my email and I see this new email from her, and I was just like, I'm contacting her. And we got connected, and basically I was like, look, please, I understand how attached you are to what you want to do, but can you please, what if you were to share this letter that you wrote? And she was like, oh my God, are you serious? Like, I've never done that. I'm so impressed and so happy that you want that, but I don't know how is it gonna be received. And I said, well, just take a risk. And the experience that she wrote about was her flying from, I think, through Istanbul or somewhere from Europe, from Rome through Istanbul and back to Afghanistan, and seeing over 50 Afghan men being deported from Europe back to Afghanistan. And having to carry their goods, whatever belongings they had, in these transparent plastic bags, and shivering from cold because they were not given their clothes, just wearing their, just the Perantamban, the traditional Afghan clothes. And she wrote something so self-reflective, so sharing her guilt, her voicelessness, her, but again, it wasn't just like a crying, thing. It was something so poetic and creative, and yet touching, that when she sat and read it in field meeting, like half of the audience was in tears. It changed and shifted the beginning of the second day of field meeting, where like everyone sort of had to go to the heart. That's sorry if I took so long to tell that story, but it's an example of kind of a risk taking, because for me too, it was like.
But I think it also plays to Shumon in this idea of format. Like for her, perhaps that the best conversation format for her was a letter, right? So I think that's, beautiful.
Actually, I forgot to mention, I've been running a annual summer program in London for 8-9 years now called Format. And so that is something I'm very interested in, because the inspiration is something that Samuel Beckett said about James Joyce, the very early draft of what would become Finnegan's Wake. And Beckett said form is content, content is form, and then later, you could say McLuhan's Medium is the Massage is the kind of electronic version, like update of that. And so, and obviously some of you will know that Hans-Ulrich Obrist and Douglas Coupland and I did an upgrade of Medium as the Massage, which was published in '67, and we sort of updated that. But that's also an extraordinary format. It's this kind of, which is also there in Ways of Seeing. There's this kind of experimental paperback. But as to kind of memories, I mean, there are so many, but the one that, I guess the ones that I remember are the ones that kind of give me tingles. And I guess I get tingles when I feel that I'm seeing and hearing a kind of a thought taking shape for the first time, and that, I mean, it's in that sense it's interesting to, or I would say it's useful for us to remember that. I mean, if you think about the last books of Roland Barthes and of Italo Calvino, they're actually the collections of their lectures. So 6 memos for the millennium, were his kind of unfinished lectures at Harvard in 1985, and sadly he died before giving the last one. So there's this kind of mythic value to the last the last memo. And then Barth, privately he was sort of, his big project was to write a novel, right, called Vita Nova. But instead, what he did was gave this extraordinary series of lectures called preparations for a novel. And so I think, the really great academics, right, so, and whether it's Foucault or whoever, would use the stage as an experimental space for thought, right? So, and that's when it becomes dialogical and it becomes dialectical with an astute audience, because and then you get those chains, right? Because then you'll get the students, Lacan from Freud, Melanie Klein, etc., etc. And so anyway, there have been moments, and like where I feel that's happening. So Kojo Eshen from the Otolith group is someone that's just doing this constantly, and he's in that sense a kind of mythical being because he's constantly doing that. And actually we did a whole thing about gifts. We did a whole, with the Otolith group, about, if every era gets the media it deserves, why do we deserve gifts now? But actually they turned it on its head, of course, because we think of the GIF, of course, as this kind of like syncopated, circular little bit of lols, right? But actually they had discovered a website dedicated to melancholic GIFs, to sad GIFs that are actually from feature films, that almost like tableau vivant, and then they built this whole like theoretical edifice around it, which was just like blew my mind, and I was interviewing them at the same time. Another instance was Hito Stehl, who many of you will know, who's of course someone that's just like, whose brain is like extraordinary. I'd done a conversation with her on stage, and she introduced me to social credit scores, to algorithmic governance, like all these things that we're now talking about. But she was thinking about this 3 or 4 years ago, and then immediately after her, we had this amazing conversation about the future. And for her, it was a very dark place that was going to end in kind of algorithmic surveillance capitalism. Eli Ayash, I'd invited Eli Ayash, who's this also extraordinary kind of like syncretic thinker, who used to be like a futures trader on the French bourse, then basically went to university, studied philosophy, Merleau-Ponty and Henri Bergson, and wrote a book called Blank Swan, which is essentially about a way of understanding the financial market through metaphysics. And then followed that up with a book called The Medium of Contingency, where it's like the best way to understand like the financial markets is actually through Mallarmé. Anyway, Ellie is giving this talk it's just like extraordinary. And I'm sitting next to Hito Stehl, and she's getting tingles because she's never heard like anyone talk this syncretically before, that makes the link between like futures trading, the financial market, Mallarmé and Bergson. And so Hito's getting tingles. I'm getting tingles because Hito's getting tingles. And the whole thing is like a tingle fest. And so anyway, those are the great moments for me. And I guess I would sort of just suffix that by of course, therefore the worst talks are when people just phone it in. And they've, it's something that's on their laptop, and they've opened that PowerPoint 900 times, or it's a version of this, and we've never met before until we get on stage, and and we've got basically nothing to say to each other. So I think these things, obviously there are many contributing factors to what makes a good conversation, but as I say, it's that thing. I don't know what it is, but I know when I see it. And that's the case for me, I think.
Fantastic. That's great. Oh, I love it. It's so great. And
Tingle Fest.
Before I launch into my thing, I want to also talk about format, where I remember when I went to the Global Forum and you had, instead of a long auditorium like this with the stage and this kind of broadcasting thing. You had a long, skinny stage, and the audience was only 3 rows deep, so everyone was pretty much in the front row.
Yeah.
You couldn't sit in the back and like not participate.
Yeah.
Like
No, you always have
everyone
to
was right
flip it.
there.
Yeah, you have to turn it 90 degrees.
Come closer, everyone.
I mean, Diana's been to the gallery, and we have a little pit, which is the old courtyard of the house, and that's the terrace of the new gallery. But that pit there, as you can see, there, is where a lot of the conversation happens. So and the architecture we spoke about, as you spoke about, plays a big role, because instead of putting us here, we put the people inside the pit, which inverts the proscenium completely, and it allows a certain kind of vulnerability at the same time, and intimacy that allows people to open up, and that's something
important.
that's important.
That's important. So for Art Basel and Art Basel Miami Beach, we started a thing where Annalie Graf and I would basically, when we invite the moderators, say that you have to talk to the speakers beforehand. It's really, we really encourage the pre-talk, and then also getting in the green room and then having the energy where it seems like being there 40 or 30 minutes before is like terribly like, I've got so many things to do, I'm at an art fair. But that we found that the energy in the green room, getting in a sync together, really is the warm-up, and that when there's a good green room energy, that happens on stage. And then to expand a little on the idea of like a talk where something came up that I wasn't expecting that was impactful, and also looping in this idea of long relationships that we were talking about, like long-term engagements, and your style of interviewing people again and again and bringing them so that there's an extended conversation. I was fortunate enough to do a public art commission with Alserkal Avenue last year, and I invited an artist that I knew really well, Hale Tenger. And so I'd done a project with her with Protocinema, and then we brought her here. We were together for like 10 days installing and everything. And then, we did a talk together, but since we were, basically every day and every night installing, getting really close, and, when we started doing the talk, things came up that like she never even told me before in the years that I knew her. And her piece was about, oppression and injustice, and then how she got there, and things that happened in her early life where she reacted in a way where it wasn't okay. She didn't agree, and she wanted to push against it, and how that happened for her. And I never heard these stories. I didn't know any of this before. And so it was really beautiful and poetic that it happened, and also in a really intimate kind of talk setting. And I'm really grateful.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting tingles right now, but I think we were talking earlier about like...
Maybe that's just the air conditioning.
Could be. Thank you, Shumon. I guess to pull off his gifts, I was in a talk recently with Shumon in the audience, and he misread the speaker speaking about not having the means to travel is not having the memes to travel, and I was receiving some very interesting ones. But about that experience, which I'll use as a pivot point, I had it from the audience, had an extremely moving experience watching a moderator be moved by the panel he was on. So this was during Zoe Butt's March meeting, and Andrew Chuan Nguyen of the Propeller Group was talking about a project he did of about Senegalese soldiers who had gone to Vietnam when they were subjects of France, and who had come back with Vietnamese wives, or who had had children with Vietnamese women. And he was saying that through this research process, he came across this word travailleur. My French is terrible, but the moderator then, it looked like he was crying, because he said that actually for the first time he knew the name to give to his grandfather, because he had never known his grandfather's name. And it was just, again, this thing, like, I think in a world, you guys have heard this from me many times, like, when is a conversation a human conversation, and when is it a marketing tool? But to see that the power of, bringing people together and what this can do. And another experience I had in that panel, also thinking about format and thinking about what you said about months and months and months of preparations. So the next thing I want to talk about is language. So we're all here speaking in English, but in a place where actually the majority of people don't speak English. So in Bangladesh, where I run the summit, my panels are mostly, we have Bangla panels too, but I'm thinking in English for an audience that thinks in Bangla. What was really cool about Zoe's March meeting was that she had singers and poets reciting everything in their own language, but they had used the time to actually translate and check the translation and in real time have what they were saying behind them so people could have an entry point, but the speaker could speak in the language they were most comfortable in. How do you guys deal with this language issue?
So there, I think that for me that question is always present, and you know, it's sometimes disempowering to have to almost accept the reality that everything is expected to happen in English everywhere, and how that may marginalize so many phenomenal minds from being part of a conversation. And you know, for myself, it starts with empathy, and just the reality that I come from a place where in one time, just 200 years ago, we all spoke each other's languages. And I'm talking about Central Asia. I'm talking about Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, where, you know, all the languages were shared and spoken, and now I go there and I have to speak in English and everyone is speaking back to me in Russian. Two foreign languages in this space that once was full of so many languages. And you know, on the one hand, this can turn into like a sob story. On the other hand, I also look at the fact that these spaces are no longer what it was before. The fact of the matter is that the 20th century, all the schisms have absolutely fragmented spaces, but it also has brought in all these various cosmopolitan, created the cosmopolitan. Like if you go to Kazakhstan, I had to myself teach myself that, you know, what is my expectation, that there's a Korean Kazakh, and there's the you know, the Ukrainian Kazakh now, and there's the Romanian Kazakh, and I also had to open space and away from culturalism and you know, racism and ethnicism to open myself up to this new space from which I now have to be responsible to present that narrative as well, because they belong there just as much as anyone else. And so I have to keep all of these things in the back of my mind when I'm trying to invite someone to do something, but also find a way for them to express themselves in the most powerful, creative way, where it's not necessarily about not focusing on the language or what is being said, but what makes us tingle is energy. It's that you know, that acupuncture point where that needle goes and something whoosh opens up, and so that's what I try to focus on. Sometimes the format is, you know, just creating a video ahead of time and doing something like, for example, a Korean artist who happens to live in Italy, we went back and forth, and you know, he was very uncomfortable about his language skills. And he came, I said, you know what, I fully trust you, you will find a way. All I know is that I want you to be in this forum. And at the end, he created this fantastic video of himself, like just showing his day in a very humorous way in the studio where he's making work, and then he goes and has a coffee, and the sculpture is like sitting with him in the coffee shop, and then, you know, just he spoke 2 or 3 things, and at the end of his piece, he just did a headstand on stage. And it was like, wow, like so we can address language in ways that is empowering. There are examples of doing that, but we just have to like also give room to that and not get stuck in the complaining zone.
I consider myself to be in a privileged position in that situation, because in India we have so many languages, and children grow up speaking 5, 6, sometimes 8 languages, which is really a gift. And in a way, it's a losing gift. I think we are becoming more like, as education is, and we spoke about education a little while ago. Education and unlearning the education is as important as going through the curriculum, and how language can become, actually language is the only colonial power that still controls us, in terms of it's still holding us under its wrench. And as a country like India becomes a global, whatever it is becoming, we are losing that sense of individuality. At the same time, the homogeneity, all the kind of different strings pulling at each other. And language, therefore, I think is very important for us to recognize the power of multilingualism, the power of being able to understand and speak to each other in each other's language, which becomes a kind of a way to enter into another's world. And one way we've managed to tackle it to some extent in our programming is to use mediums that go beyond the spoken word. For example, things like music that connects people from a vibration point of view, or from a feeling point of view, that is not restricted to the power, the mastery of language. Samson Young, one of our artists, had a solo with us, took a line from Fanon's text, Frantz Fanon's text, which said, "The mastery of language affords remarkable power." So the mastery of language as a power tool is something that we have to recognize and fight against in a way, but at the same time use its power to reach out to the right kind of people.
Yeah, but then on the other side, the idea about the right for opacity, and that while we do want to understand, and we're all working on building bridges, and being understood is one of the rights of human existence. When Arthur Yaffa was speaking in Miami, he was talking about how he makes his art for other Black people. And if other people of other races and colors understand it and get something from it, that's lovely. He's happy, but his discourse is specifically with that intention. And it's okay. We don't have to explain our culture to everybody else. There is a space for not understanding, which I think is just as powerful as understanding.
Absolutely. So we've been speaking for a while, and I wanted, before we open it to the floor, do you guys have any questions for each other? Because I've been asking too many questions.
How do you build, we were talking about this idea of hospitality and building trust, and it takes a long time to build trust and a short time to bring. How do you make your speakers feel comfortable, Shumon? I feel like you have some tactics. Maybe you could share them with us.
Yeah, especially telling them the tingles come from the AC.
Sends them gifts.
Yeah, you set up WhatsApp groups, and then you barrage people with gifts. No, actually, I guess there are, when I try and introduce it to people that I don't necessarily know, because the cast tends to be a combination of people who are returning, either as guests or audience to guest, and so there's already a familiarity and a kind of intimacy to the culture of what we're trying to do. But then, you also need to kind of diversify the gene pool, because otherwise we know what happens, right? So yes, you then need to kind of like try and explain, hopefully in as succinct a way as possible, to someone who hasn't been, what this thing is. And I guess, sometimes it's easier to say what something isn't, so I'm like, this is not academic. This is not, this is intimate. Mm-hmm. And sometimes intimate, sometimes casual. Casual and intimate can be interchanged, but I think intimate is important. And that use it, do something here that you can't do anywhere else, because you've got nothing writing on it, right?
Have you been reading my guidelines?
I hacked your email. Very easy. No, so, and then the other thing is, well, okay, the audience is also going to be heterogeneous. Yeah. And so, if you're used to giving, 50 lectures to the National Association of Ophthalmologists, This one time you don't need to, because actually the audience, maybe there's one ophthalmologist, but there's something and someone from everywhere and everything, and see all these things as kind of like assets, as positive virtues to exploit for this one moment, and that goes back. You use the word risk. I mean, risk, vulnerability, exposure, there are lots of kind of synonyms and tags we could use here. The point being, treat it as something special. Because if it's just another kind of like thing on the gravy train, so what, right? Like, I think audiences know that, and we know that. And so again, if you want to feel something, whatever that is, so if you want to feel moved, if you want to feel intellectually, again, kind of like blown away, it's only going to happen if someone is investing on the stage, as it were. But I think they have to be convinced to do that, because if the invitation is on autopilot, so too will the presentation be, So you have to put the work in, basically, I think.
I do it in a very, I do it as in we, both Priyanka and I we have certain things that we kind of try and like to make the, it's going to sound frivolous, but it works, and it can work with anybody. I think things that are non-physical, although I love gifts, are actually touch in very different ways. So for example, if we have the opportunity of having the speaker or the panelists or whatever participants a bit earlier than before, I think things like, we spoke about this before as well, things like a really nice meal, like food and conversations are the right way to break the kind of ease people out. And especially even with language. I mean, people feel comfortable with each other when you share that kind of intimacy of sharing food, for example. We do things like that, or invite them home and make it a more personal relationship. So that barriers break a bit.
I remember at Asia Society a few years ago when Okui spoke, he said, curators are not concierge. And I was like, huh, like, yeah, okay, that's
lucky you.
Like maybe for you now, Okui. I mean, with all due respect, like I have ended up at the in the middle of the night after like writing freaking 1,000 blurbs and sending it over to get edited and all that. Have had to like last minute buy somebody a ticket because that's just what it takes. So it's about it's about what it takes. What does it take? I mean, field meeting has kicked my ass over and over and over again. Field meeting, this organizing this thing. Every time I'm like, I got it by now. I know what's gonna happen. I know exactly, and it just gets harder and harder. And what I have to constantly do is to drop the complaint and be like, how much do I want this? How worth is it? How worth is it for me to be in the presence of these beautiful beings? And what am I gonna do to first go through the process of preparing and not being on autopilot? To check yourself on when you're being on autopilot, because you can be on autopilot at any moment. It's easy place to go, and that makes a huge difference. And so, yes, food, hospitality, getting them to be there a little earlier, the guidelines, like really, I've been called, authoritarian sometimes, a police woman, all of these things, but I'm more than willing to take those things on, because I know it comes from love and respect, and that if I put all of that clarity of what I want to create out there, I will get back some of that, and everybody else will get some of it. And it's okay for me to be perceived like a control freak if that's what it takes, right? But because it's not actually exactly control freak, because it is about caring, and curating is the word curating. Maybe you can. What does it mean, actually? I mean,
It comes from curare, which means to take care of.
To heal.
It's a religious term.
Yeah.
It's a religious term.
A religious term.
Well, a clerical term. I mean, it's from a clerical term.
Okay.
Want to stay away from that.
Okay, I'll stop talking now.
I think also the thing about like why are all these symposiums and forums and summits going on? What's going on? Is that on one level that talking is a way of mainlining ideas, and so we're like, art's a form of communication, but really when you talk, you mainline it. It feels really good. And the other thing is that we get together, and we're all living beings, and we generate and send out vibrations, and these vibrations are also. I'm getting energy from all you guys right now, and this is extremely important. And then the other thing is when we talk together, we stand together, and there are countries we can't do this. It's illegal. It's because it has impact and power, and it generates other things to happen. So that's what we're doing here.
Absolutely. And to kind of take this and bring you guys all in, I also have to really thank all of you in the sense that this started at 6:30 on a Saturday night, and you're all here with us. And, we want you all to go out and have great conversations with your friends and have an awesome weekend. But so maybe to kind of wrap this up and open it to the floor, we're talking about connectivity, being open to hear other people. I want to talk about an experience I had with Jack Garrity, who's here in the audience, because he is the partner of Pasita Abad, who's showing downstairs, or I don't know, I haven't seen it yet. I want to see it after this, but is showing here at Art Basel. And I'm not even really on LinkedIn, but somehow I got some email from LinkedIn as if I was, and I clicked on it, and I had received a message from Jack about that I should know about this artist Pasita Abad because she had spent some time in Bangladesh. And we ended up corresponding that way, and I learned more about her work. I invited Jack to Dhaka, and he came to speak, and he was making connections with people who knew Pasita before, and we learned so much more. But I think it's also being open to these people outside of your orbit to come into a conversation. And so with that, I would love, does anyone here in the audience want to come up, or does anyone have any comments, questions, contributions? Anne Barlow? Yay. Hey, Anne, come on up. No, okay.
That's why we should have been sitting down. Then anyone would be part of the conversation. Yeah.
It's kind of a reflection or a comment, first of all, and then maybe a question. But having done a series of symposia in New York called What Now, what was interesting to me is that seeds of each one began to feed into another. So there was a kind of organic quality about them that I didn't even imagine would happen at the beginning. And then you've all spoken, I think, really eloquently about the impact on yourselves of these kinds of conversations and on each other. And the question that always came up at the end of doing, the most mind-blowing conversations, from the funders and everything is like, well, how many people came? What did they get out of it? And so you're always kind of forced to think of that no matter what. And of course, you're doing it out of interest in sharing ideas. But for each of you, how does the audience figure in your minds? Because you're kind of dealing with slightly different contexts and audiences, and not necessarily thinking of concrete outcomes in that way, but what have been maybe some of the most meaningful things that have happened as a result of you engaging with conversation in the ways that you do?
I can address that a bit. I guess it has to be very clear that the work that I'm trying to do is in two folds. One, Asia Contemporary Art Week is to sort of, again, all this content, all this activity that's taking place in Asia and all this unfolding of histories and trajectories, how can this be shared or somehow channeled through the ocean over there in the States, where it's full of so many institutions, universities, museums, and galleries, and frankly, a good amount of them without any meaningful content. So how does this get channeled through? So the selection process of even thinking about who's being invited has everything to do with the organic process, the falling in love process, where you fall in love with someone's ideas, and where you have managed to also open up a thought for yourself and for others. the other part is the responsibility of then also how do you have this other like larger narrative that's going on, larger picture of how are you impacting the gaps, what is missing, because that's what we started. All of us started this, our programs from addressing something that was missing. And so what's missing in New York, in a place like capital space, is the fact that a great deal of content does not make it into the institution or the gallery until 20 years later, or 50 or 60 or 100 years later, when either the artist or the content producers are either not interested anymore or dead, or the conversation is not necessarily relevant. It's kind of like it goes through the stamping process, right? And so field meeting and possibly even global art forum, or what you're doing, it's kind of addressing the immediacy of what's happening right now. What is really taking place, and what is being discussed and what is being researched, looked at, plowed through by multiple people at the same time, and how can they all maybe find something from each other's practices, be connected. And the other part for me is the addressing of the impact that I want to make is to address the fragmentation of Asia as a continent itself, where the gaze has always been outside, and there's this enumeration of how to go out and take content outwards when there are countries and regions right here in this space that could be a lot more probably connected, relevant, related, and why not nurture this space? This is how Europe was able to sort of stand out so well, because it's had 500 years of institutionalization process that we in Asia have not yet had, and it's just the beginning of it, and everybody expects us to do it in like 50 years right now, but it's going to take a long time. But that means that instead of what the Afghan king did in the 1920s, where he sent 20 artists from Afghanistan to Germany, to choose to reverse that and maybe send them to Japan, right? Or Indonesia. What would happen if we were to have this discussion? So the impact for me is sort of not necessarily about the numbers, but what happens where all of these individuals get connected, and then they themselves have their own bonds and get invited to residencies and get invited to programs, and just like all kinds of magical things that happen, friendships even, like just support.
And looking inwards.
Not inwardness, though.
In the art field, there's a lot of talk about relationships. It's all about relationships. And I think, actually, I just want to put out there that this word of friendship is not a frivolous, light, casual word. It's actually very serious. And when someone is a friend, there's respect and trust, and these are things that take a long time to build. And so ideally, we hope that this comes out of having these kinds of conversations, but it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen just one day on stage. It's something that takes a long time to build. So just putting that out there.
Great. Okay. Rebecca? You have a mic, don't worry.
Thank you. I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot with these conversations is how do we prevent ourselves from becoming too sanitized?
Oh, yeah.
From having a lot of the times when we speak on these panels, the conversations ahead of time or after at dinner are even more interesting, because we can say what we really think. Last week at the Beijing Art Summit, we were speaking to 8,000 people not in the room with us because we were live streamed. And, there was this adorable moment on stage where John Gerard found that out 45 minutes into the talk. And all of a sudden he looked at me and was like, oh crap, what have I said? This sort of retrospect panic. And I think that's natural and understandable, and we all do that and have to do that. But now in this world where everything we do is being tweeted and mistweeted or misquoted, how do we create that safe space to have real dialogue and conversation that we all need to have with each other? and still make it open to the public? I don't know that there is a real answer to that, but it's something I've really been thinking about as I talk with my clients about shaping initiatives and things. How do we keep things real and authentic and give people that safe space to think and talk, but still open it up and embrace technology and these new mediums? It's a real challenge.
I'll leave this to others, but I think that word you said, safe, is really important because it isn't always safe to have those kinds of discussions. So I was just in a discussion with the queen of an indigenous community in Bangladesh, and there was an intelligence officer there. So there was a moment to know, okay, we are going to speak in English, and things will go another way. But like safe is very important.
We have, whenever we have our Curators Hub, because we have guests come, because I'm Indian, and we have a very complicated relationship with our neighbor. I have people visiting us before our thing from the Ministry of Human Resource Development, as they call it, to check on us and find out who's coming and are they actually coming, etc. So safe, the idea of safe is, I think, comes from kind of opening up a one-on-one kind of a dialogue. But also, we discussed it before in our pre-conversation, is sometimes we are also aware of, like Leeza said, you are aware of when you create self-checks upon yourself and realize when the conversation is counterproductive, and when is it time to stop. And
but if it were sanitized, that woman would have not been on the talk,
exactly.
right? So it's
Exactly.
finding a dialogue between those things.
All right, so another thing, Verika, that's a really good question, is that in different parts of the world, there's different ways to move around what you can and cannot say. So inviting people to be in the conversations that maybe understand where they can maneuver so they feel more comfortable, but then putting them with people that they're new to the context, and so they can kind of help guide each other also could be another way.
No, but I think it's important to be, honest about the format. Yeah. This is a phenomenally artificial construct. This is not how we sit at home when we're having a conversation with each other. Yeah. We have to, we'd be sitting around, as you say, we'd be sitting around a meal, we'd be having a coffee, we'd be in a cab, we'd be on a plane,
we'd have
memes.
Et
cetera. We'd have memes. But,
and
this is its own thing. Yeah. But I think, again, one of the ways in which, to try and pass this with Anne's thing about audience, would be, there's what happens on the stage, but then there's what happens after. But by after, I don't just mean, 5 minutes after, 10 minutes after. I also mean 10 years after, and 20 years after, and 30 years after. And in that sense, I'm like a romantic sap about the power of, public discourse. Because in the same way, I think that, people always talk about a book that changed your life, and a film that changed your life, a song that changed your life. Talks have changed my life. Yeah. Talks have changed the trajectory that I thought, I was going on, and then they detour me somewhere else. And that's a profound thing. I can't necessarily quantify that, but I hope that those things have happened. I do know they've happened because people do tell me, but it's not also incumbent upon everyone to tell me that they've had this profound epiphany and it changed their life. But I know it's happened, and I do think, and I don't know, there's this thing in writing. One of the most cliched, things about a novelist, so who do you write for, right? As though there's this kind of ideal audience. And I think for me, the best writers are I write for myself, right? Like, I've got to write for, and if I don't please myself to something, then I'm not doing my job. Yeah. And if you do that, basically, if you make something that's good, it will do the work.
Totally. And
that's what you have to trust. And so anyway, I think I do agree with you, but I also think that, again, to like what Mari was saying, that every context, geographical context, has hard lines and has porous kind of lines, and actually for example in the Middle East, I think that writers, journalists, and fiction writers, are under much greater scrutiny, often, right, from, let's say, political power than visual artists are. It's just how it is. and maybe that has to do with traditions of literacy, right? Like, I mean, the word is there, right? Like, whereas an image or a sound or an installation or an object floats in a much more ambiguous kind of space. And so, you have to play with these conventions, right?
Yeah.
And that's about being kind of versed and understanding the nuances of context.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, again, hopefully, if this, and not by this I don't mean this specifically, but whatever happens on a stage, if it's doing the work, there's the time leading up to it and there's the time after it. And it's just a small fraction of like a sort of much larger entropic possibility, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And then on the flip side, the things that are not said are equally as important as what's said.
Between the lines.
And then maybe sometimes being small and invisible is the best way to go.
We're over time.
Great. So with that, thank you, Art Basel. Thank you, Stephanie. And, taking your cue, go talk to someone. Sadly, we're out of time, but go talk to someone, go listen to someone. And
then tell us that we changed your life.
Yeah.
Or tell us who changed your
In the
life.
future, if you ever see us again,
Just give us a
tell
hug.
us, oh my God.
Or just
You are
send,
profound.
Never the same
just
again.
send him gifts.
Send me gifts. Thank you very much.